problem. So it's a positive thing for your economy. And it's not an accident that the best economic locations of growth in the United States are those who are part of this alliance that Christiana talked about. So the day after President Trump made his statement about Paris, within a day, we'd stood up an organization called the United States Climate Alliance. So we have an alliance of 14 states and 1 territory. We are committed to the Paris agreements. We are all acting in our own way to do that. And we would be the 3rd largest economy of the world if our 14 states were one nation. Now, I am not suggesting that those states become a separate nation, but we are acting, and it's not slowing us down. So actually the message of Davos, I think, is that President Trump has been a one-man parade with no one behind him because no one has followed him out of the Paris Agreement. Actually, we've had 3 Republican governors join us rather than his retrograde effort to deny science. So the momentum is very much to continue this effort that came out of the Paris Agreement, and well that it is. So we're very optimistic about what we're doing in our state.
And the same is true of many in the corporate world, is that not so, Mr. Sivesma?
Right. Well, let's turn to the people who cause the emission, the private sector to a large degree, or the consumers of our products. And I hope we don't need to discuss the reasons why we need to address climate change. I hope it's so obvious, the science and the issues we see already today, the people who suffer today. So if we don't go into the topic of the climate skeptic people, why do we need to address, but go immediately to how do we solve it, then we say we need to do 3 things as a private sector. We need to reduce our own emissions. We need to enable the whole supply chain to do better, and we need to advocate. Reduce our own emission, set targets, science-based. We have a carbon budget. We need to be at the peak, ultimately in 2020, 2050 neutral. Then means you need to have absolute reduction targets as the private sector. Secondly, enable. Try to develop new innovations, make cars more lightweight, so less fuel, less CO2, boosting the output of solar panels. Or, let's not forget, the agricultural sector, developing new feed ingredients. We just did, reducing the emissions of cows. We call them clean cows. So those kind of things, enable is also a possibility. And of course, then advocate, be strong. We have now 81 companies, big multinational companies, joining us in the way of climate leaders who advocate clearly putting a price on carbon to stimulate all to take really tough measures and having a financial economic incentive to do that, including, by the way, the investors who invest in their companies. And I think it is important to reduce their own emissions and enable and to put effort in innovation. And I think this just makes good business sense to future-proof your company. 10 years ago, I was questioned, is it making profit or doing well for the world? Today, 10 years later, we can show those 2 things can go hand in hand, at least in our company. I'm sure if you sit here in 10 years from now, if as a company you did not address those things, you don't make profit anymore, and your investors will find that out. So it makes sense, and the world is changing.
So we've got a panel here of climate optimists from the global level, from the multinational level, and the local level. We've actually reached out to the great global public through our social media channels, and I've got some questions here that I'll put to our panelists. If anybody in the audience would like to ask a question, let me know, and I will come to you in a minute. This is a question for you, Christiana, and it comes from Kendall Tyson in Chicago in the United States. What solutions are you working towards to solve the issue of air pollution, and what innovative projects have you seen that provide people with clean and safe energy?
Well, you know, it's interesting because air pollution actually is one part of the problem. It's not everything. So if you look at fossil fuels, which have caused global warming and climate change, it is the same burning of those fossil fuels that cause air pollution. But it's 2 different types of pollution. One is the local pollution, the local particulates that come out of the burning of fossil fuel from our cars, from our factories, et cetera, which is causing harm to the respiratory system of humans, which is why we need to move beyond that. And the same burning of the same fossil fuels is what's causing global pollution, which is different particulates, different gases, which is what's causing climate change. But the source is the same. So whether you're interested in your own personal health, in your public health, if you're a political leader, or if you're in the medical system, or whether you're interested in the planetary health, it's the same problem. It is putting the fossil fuel industry, thank them truly, because much of what we're enjoying today is thanks to the fossil fuel industry. So thank them for what they did in the past century, but then just like any other little old lady, put them to retirement. It is time to retire the fossil fuel industry as a whole and move toward the cleaner fuels of this century. So everything under the Paris Agreement, actually, and everything that is being done by the local governments, by state governments, by corporates, is actually moving us slowly but surely, not fast enough, away from fossil fuels, which has been the bedrock of our society, into cleaner fuels that will allow us to continue our economic development, very important, but without the toxic effects from fossil fuels.
Feike, what would you say are the, when you're making decisions on behalf of your corporation, what are the most important incentives that factor in your mind when you're thinking about making climate decisions that are climate related?
It's what I said, by the way. I can build on what Christiana was saying about putting them into retirement, and she called even the fossil industry the black rock or something like that. What did you say?
Like a little old lady.
Like a little old lady.
Thank her and put her in retirement.
And, right. And why should we or could we put them into retirement? Because there are better alternatives today.
Cheaper?
It is a little bit the analogy with the Stone Age. I mean, why did we move out of the Stone Age? Not because we were short of stones, but there were better alternatives. Yeah. And it's not that we are short of coal, to be honest, in the world, but there are better alternatives.
Or gas or oil.
Or gas or oil. There are better alternatives. And that is exactly what we take into consideration with our decisions. There are better alternatives to the future. There will come a price on carbon. China just started with it. Europe just withdrawing the allowances. The Americas, including Washington, are linking their systems. If you, as a company, do not see the writing on the wall, do not see that you need to address this, just from an economic perspective, you have a responsibility, I believe also. But if you say it goes beyond my responsibility as a global citizen, I just take economic decisions. Imagine you do that. I go further, but imagine. Then it makes good business sense to address your business in such a way you become climate proof. You reduce your own emissions because you will pay for it. That you develop products which help this world to make a step forward because you will make money of that. The new climate economy report showed clearly that we can show economic growth. We don't have to go back to old history. We can show economic growth via addressing climate change. So for me, it just made good business sense. We transformed our company. And by the way, 115 years ago, we started as a coal mining company. I hardly dare to say it, but that's our history, 115 years ago. Now already 50 years ago, we changed into a chemical company. Now 15 years ago, we changed into a life science and material science company, which we are today. So you need to adjust in order to survive. I'm a biologist. Darwin taught us. Those who will survive will those who adapt.
And that's true on the local level as well. I've got a question here from Kartik in Dubai, in the United Arab Emirates. Kartik asks, there's a surge in the production and consumption of electric cars, but electric cars take electricity and electricity burns fossil fuels. Isn't that going to be more harmful than if we just stuck with the good old petrol vehicles?
Appreciate the question. The answer is no. Even with the same mix of generating capacity in your grid, electric cars can be at least marginally better as far as the CO2 net life cycle. Not much, but a little bit. But as the question indicates, the real success of electric cars are when we can clean up our grid and when we can have sources of electricity that are not CO2 sources. Now, that is well within our possibility. Today in my state, over 3/4 of our grid comes from non-CO2 emitting sources, over 3/4. So we have a capacity to do that. Now, we're blessed with hydroelectric in my part of the world, so that's one of the reasons. But what we are finding is that we can rapidly move away from fossil fuels, even for that remaining percentage. And our utilities are finding ways to do that as well. So we are closing our only remaining coal-fired plant in the state of Washington. We are moving off of coal-based electricity that otherwise would go into cars that comes from other states. And here in Davos, it's interesting, in the last 24 hours, I've talked to 3 companies that are very interested in starting some solar power plants and building electric ferries
in Washington
and
State.
win Washington State. So it's interesting, from Davos, we're finding people who see a business case for cleaning up my grid, even for the small part that still is based on fossil fuels. So the rapidity of this is quite amazing. We've had a 90% reduction in the cost of photovoltaic solar in the last 8 to 9 years. We have 90,000 people in my state now working in these clean energy sources to make the grid clean, so the electricity is virtually clean when we do put it into our electric cars. So there's every reason to be optimistic about this. And as I've said, my state is not the only state that is achieving success in this regard. By the way, we even have 3 Republican governors in our coalition who are trying to clean up their grids as well. And the reason I point this out is electric cars are a future, because we have public policy leaders to understand we're going to clean up our grid so those electric cars can be very clean. And the battery technology, the development of battery technology is so rapid, it just knock your socks off. The chemistry improvements that are being are just amazing. Mm-hmm. So we ought to be optimistic about electric cars. In fact, I just have an electric car that was going to be delivered tomorrow. I'm buying it used because I'm very sort of Scottish on this. And but they delivered the wrong car, so we'll be back maybe next week with a new electric car.
With a new, so what I'm hearing is there are a ton of already, there are existing economic incentives to make this shift. By your own admission
I think you're also hearing, very interesting from the governor, is that those jurisdictions, in this case a state, that put in place these policies actually attract investment. It's not that, at this point you don't no longer have to go and look for it. Those companies that are in this new economy will very quickly flock toward those jurisdictions that have the policies that are providing these incentives. And those jurisdictions will be providing more employment, better air, better health, better energy security. So, it's not just that the renewable energy is a better investment against fossil fuel. It's actually that there is economic, for the entire economy, there is benefit from moving into the cleaner technologies.
And if I may add some of these, what we are finding is that when you have policies that inspire people getting access to electric cars and solar panels and more insulation, it attracts the manufacturers and the producer, because they want to be close to their customer. Yep. And they want to have a market brand that is associated with a sustainable approach, as you do, and that's a market benefit. So good behavior attracts good investment. That's what we've learned in the state of Washington.
And in addition, I tell you, the investors slowly, but they are getting it. More and more pension funds, more and more investors, more and more insurance companies want also to future-proof their investment. And they're also scared, if they have invested in the wrong things, that over time they will be hurt. So they see also the writing on the wall, and they want to be invested in the right things. And therefore, those kind of initiatives attract new investors, and that's good.
You said earlier that at current rates, we are not on track to meet the Paris Climate Accord's objective of well less than 2 degrees. What do we have to do now, next year, and 2020 to meet your mission of peak emissions?
Well, now there is a challenge. There is a challenge, because the fact is that the science of climate change has advanced even since 2015. And we were not aware in 2015 or 14 when we were, and 15 when we were moving toward the Paris Agreement, of how precipitous the change or the moment in time is upon us when we will actually decide as a society, can we bring climate change under control or not? And the fact is that that has now been pinpointed to be the year 2020. So within 2 years, or 3 if you count the end of 2020, we have to have been at the point as a global society that we have to reverse the trend that is currently still going up. Despite all of our optimism, despite everything that we're saying, we are not at the critical mass of reversing the global trend. We're in the transition period, but we're not reversing the trend. So we have to, within maximum 3 years, reverse that trend and not just flatten out our emissions, but actually begin a pretty rapid descent so that by 2050, we will be at a net zero economy. A big challenge.
So how?
How? Well, first of all, we are on track to have 23% of energy on the global grid be renewable by 2020. Close, but no cigar. We need it to be actually 30%. We are mobilizing capital. We're currently coming up to $400 billion being invested every year globally into clean technologies. Okay, but we need to move it to 1 trillion. We have had on transportation, we have had over the past 3 to 4 months, the announcements of 7 major companies in China, in Europe, and in the United States, that they're moving toward the post-internal combustion engine, toward electric vehicles, and each of them have given their dates. Very good, but we would have to be seriously on track where every major city of the world, and currently we have only a few, but every major city of the world has to have had the policy already in place by 2020 that they're going to actually start either levying a tax or prohibiting the use of polluting cars. Every major city of the world, and currently we have only a few, but every major city of the world has to have had the policy already in place by 2020 that they're going to actually start either levying a tax or prohibiting the use of polluting cars. To give you just a few examples of the many different areas in which we need much more speed. On all of them, we have traction. On all of them, we're moving in the right direction. It's the speed and scale that is a problem.
So there's a gap of 7% between where we need to be on energy, on electricity. We need another $600 billion in investment in clean.
Did you bring your checkbook?
I'm ticking off the boxes here. So the question is, you can do what you can in Washington State. Give us a couple of examples of what you are doing to help close these gaps.
So as we speak, we are attempting to pass America's first carbon tax, which will create a price signal to spur investment, and will also, importantly, create about a $3 billion investment fund in my state over a biennium so that we can help consumers get access to the electric cars, so we can help businesses get access to new efficiencies to reduce CO2 emissions, so that we can help people in insulating their homes so we don't waste energy, so we can make additional investments in our incredible research institutes, so we can train people in the new businesses in clean energy. So we're excited about that. I'm 2 weeks into my legislative session, and we hope we can achieve it. We're also looking at avenues to have a low-carbon fuel standard as a potential alternative to a carbon tax, or an additional one, which will essentially require the industry to give us cleaner fuels. And it's been very effective in California, and we're looking at a way to do that. And Oregon, thank you very much. Under Kate Brown's tremendous leadership, we have two great Governor Browns in Oregon and California. We are looking at essentially a clean fuels mandate for the grid, so that any future generating capacity would need to be renewable. We're also looking for additional incentives for electric car usage. So we have multiple avenues. All of these make sense. We're starting with a carbon charge because we believe it's the most flexible, so that industries, rather than having a regulatory approach, would have a price signal, and then they would have the flexibility of how to make the investments to actually improve CO2. So we hope that we are successful. If anyone knows a legislator in Washington State, you feel free to share your viewpoints with them. You have a First Amendment right in America to do so, and I will defend you if you would like to do so.
Very good.
Well, here you see how the private and the public sector will work, can work hand in hand together. I mean, as a private sector, rightly so, we do not make legislation. That is up to the public sector. But as a private sector, we are a very simple sector. We react quite instinctively on financial incentives. And
even in your sleep.
That counts for all my colleagues. And I dream about other things. But nevertheless, putting a price on carbon, which is now happening in the Americas, I mean, Chile, Peru, Mexico, Canada, and of the country in between, Washington and California, Europe, China, they all put a price on carbon right now. And the investors and the private sector is reacting very simple. If there is a financial incentive to reduce my own emissions, if there is a financial incentive to do better, more innovations in this field, then they will do that. Investors will come and companies will come. So it is happening and it will happen. And therefore, the most important is, I think, to put a price on carbon. And if it's happening globally, there is also no carbon leakage of transformation of businesses move from one area to another area, because you will be bitten always, whatever happens. And in the sectors, I would say look to energy, look to traffic, because those are big emission providers, so to say. But I mentioned it already, let's not forget 18% of our total emissions, our agriculture. And that maybe has to do with our meat consumption, but also how we treat our cows. And like I said, I don't know how the cows look to regulations about themselves and how they look to their own feet, but there are solutions.
Clean cows.
And that's clean
Clean
cows.
cows.
Very good. Okay, well, this is Davos, so we keep things on time here. The number of climate skeptics on this panel is clearly none. We know, however, that there is at least one in the Congress Hall at the moment, but the message from this panel is it might not matter. Thank you for being with us until now. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank
Well
you.
said. It might not matter.
It might not
Well
matter.
said.
So soon, the financial economy was back on track. The stock market recovered. For the real economy, it took more time. You can look at that differently, as seen from the little guy. So on the ruins of the old economy, a new one is emerging, of course, driven by technology and digital giants like Amazon, which started by turning upside down the book industry. They're now coming to a brick and mortar place next to you. You know, in this economic transformation, jobs were lost. People seem to lose hope in the future. They started to wonder, is upwards mobility still working in America? So at that point came a political revolution. A populist was elected to the White House, the stablest of all geniuses. He appealed to the forgotten men and women of the United States. He said he would bring back coal jobs. His promise was America first. Well, he didn't specify first in what. Donald Trump said the problem is immigration and Muslims and people coming from, you know, shithole countries, excuse his French. He says he wants a new immigration. He wants prime quality migrants. But hey, Trump had a huge success. The tax cut. Okay, it's a tax cut that mostly favors the richest Americans, but that's fair. Why would you pay for roads and bridges when you hardly use them? So, ladies and gentlemen, here we are at the start of a new year, the start of a new era that will be profitable, hopefully, at least for the 1%. As for the others, the left behind, they are left wondering, will trickle-down economics work? And that is my question for the panel. And I now leave the stage to Donna of USA Today. Thank you.
All right, how can we top that? That was fantastic. Thank you, Patrick. So we've got a pretty serious topic to discuss after that. We're going to be talking about left behind in the United States. But before we get started on our panel, I wanted to show you a little video. Last year, after the very hard-fought presidential election, the country was feeling terribly divided. And USA Today embarked on a project to introduce our readers to extraordinary Americans. These were Americans who sought to make a difference in their communities. Big ways, little ways. They were of every race, every religion, every political persuasion. They were from red states and blue states. And we didn't ask them. We didn't ask them what their politics are. So we just wanted to present them to our readers, and the project was called I Am an American. So a few weeks ago, when I found out I was doing this panel, we went back to some of those people who we had written about, and we asked them what they felt about the state of the United States a year later. And so here is what they had to say.
5 words when I think about America today. Broken.
Dialogue.
Uncertain.
Powerful.
And challenged.
I think for America, we're heading for a crisis. There's a philosophy right now in our country that we should be more local, more America first. We need to get back to the reality that we're part of a global reality, a global community.
I think fear separates us from one another. I think the idea that those who aren't like us are out to get us, I think that's a very dangerous idea.
I think we're scared of things that we don't know, things that are new, and that we are exacerbating situations by focusing on all the differences and everything that divides us.
In my lifetime, I don't remember America ever being as divided as it is now. The lines of communication are going to have to open up, because if we continue down this path, I don't see anything necessarily good being accomplished.
Some of the issues that lay up on the surface are easy to diagnose. They're like political, religious, how we feel about gender issues. But I think it's a lot easier to hate than to love. And it takes a long time to just go in and learn someone's story rather than just hating them for one of their ideologies.
I think that we really need to look at the political party system in this country and really decide whether it is actually meeting the needs of our democracy.
I think the majority of Americans want to be a part of the world, and they want the world to be a part of them.
What worries me about the future of our country is that we're not learning from our mistakes. We've seen things that have divided us, and we're not doing anything to work towards change.
Whatever your desires are, whatever your wishes and dreams are for you and your family, it's the same for immigrant and refugees. It's the same. We all have the same dreams and the same goals. And then you think, well, how am I going to get there?
You really just have to sit down and see the humanness of your neighbor, you know? That your neighbor is more than what he or she thinks about gender fluidity, religion, or political stances. A lot of the times I just don't see people really wanting to put in that hard work.
This kind of tunnel vision thinking, this ideological approach to reality. Reality is always more complex. Reality is always messy. And you can't control life. I mean, you can try to understand life and try to help other people, but it's a journey.
Americans need compromise. They need someone to stand up and say, although I may take the political hit for this, I am going to stand up for what is right. I think we need another person of quality like George Washington to actually say no to power, to actually put that power back in the hands of the people. After all, the Constitution starts with we the people. It doesn't say we the CEOs or we the elected representatives. It's we the people. It's all of us.
Okay, so we'll get this discussion started. Let me welcome up our panelists. Okay, everybody's here? Settled in? Excellent. All right, so during our session today, it's called Left Behind in the United States, we're going to take a look at the issues that seem to be fueling that deep divide and the sense of dissatisfaction in the United States. There are actually some troubling indicators. Life expectancy in the U.S. is down for the second year in a row, and those declines are actually quite out of sync with the rest of developed nations and even some developing nations, where lives are actually getting longer and healthier. And also, we have a growing economy right now, but wages are by and large stagnant. And that is the sort of thing that really sort of cuts at the middle class. You heard some of their voices today, and now we're going to try and drill into why it is that folks feel left behind, disenfranchised, and sort of not part of the American dream. And so I'm going to start by introducing Arlie Russell Hochschild. She spent 5 years at the kitchen tables and the crawfish boils of the people of Southwest Louisiana, researching for her book, Strangers in Their Own Land, Anger and Mourning on the American Right. And she is a professor of sociology at the University of California, Berkeley. Next, we have Congressman Mark Meadows of North Carolina. He is chairman of the House Freedom Caucus. It's a group of roughly 40 conservative members of Congress, and he are dedicated to giving voice to those who feel forgotten by their government. And next, we have Mary Kay Henry. In 2010, she became the first woman elected international president of the Service Employees International Union. You probably know that as the SEIU. She has 30 years of experience organizing healthcare workers to fight for a higher minimum wage, affordable healthcare, and in general, sort of improving the lot of working families. Next, we have Mike McGavick. He is the CEO of XL Group, which is a global insurance group. He's been active in Republican politics and was a key strategist in an effort to change U.S. Superfund environmental laws. And finally, we have Dr. David Skorton. He is the 13th secretary of the Smithsonian Institution. You might know him for the Museum of Air and Space, but he oversees 19 museums and galleries, 20 libraries, I think, the National Zoo, research by the Smithsonian. And what's very interesting is his strategic plan for the Smithsonian, which calls for a focus on convening critical conversations about topics of public interest. So, now I'm going to ask you all a question. So how many people here think that in the future, for the next generations, life for Americans will be better? Please raise your hands. Okay, 5. Okay, and how many think the future for the next generation will be worse? Okay, I'd like to see that optimism. Awesome. Okay, well, so the Pew Charitable Trust, Pew Surveys did a survey in July, and they asked that question of Americans from both parties. More people say the future for the next generation will be worse, 48%, but they are actually more optimistic than you are. So, all right. On that note, we will, let's go to Arlie. So your book, you spent 5 years researching this. Tell us why you embarked on this journey and what you found.
Already in 2011, I could feel the split going. Congress was at a standstill, and I realized that I was in a bubble in Berkeley, California. And that it was a geographic bubble, it was a media bubble. I read the New York Times. It was an electronic bubble. You know, I'd open my laptop and it gave me back to myself. Then I realized that we're all in bubbles. And if I was going to really understand what was going on, I had to get out of my bubble and find an equal and opposite bubble that's as far right as Berkeley, California was left. Take my moral and political alarm system off, and permit myself a great deal of interest and curiosity to get to know the people close up that I thought I'd probably have differences with. And it's the most extraordinary experience of my academic life. It was amazing. They were wonderful people who seemed to live in a different truth in certain ways. I went in with the red state paradox question. How could it be that across the nation, it's the poorest states, the states with the worst health care, the worst fewest museums, or, you know, lowest wages, lowest life expectancy, most pollution, are also the states that receive more money from the federal government in aid than they give to it in taxes, and also fear and revile the federal government. That if you have a problem when you want some help. Louisiana, where I ended up around Lake Charles mainly, turned out to be an exaggerated version of that. Second poorest state, 44% of the state budget came from the federal government, and overwhelmingly Republican Tea Party. I was interested in the people who were most enthusiastic. I was interested in people like you, actually, and trying to get you
real life there.
And so when I got there and went fishing, I'd ask people, could you show me where you were born? Where did you go to school? What row did you sit in? You know, what church? Could we go to the church? Where are your parents buried? And the course of things, and going fishing, especially fishing. That was the best. You're in this boat, you know. And they threw that question away. They like one guy that begins the book, his name is Mike, and he was born in a sugar plantation as a child and works in oil all his adulthood, sort of the old South, the new South, and loved the Tea Party. Real, he's your guy. And I said, great, thank you so much for letting me get to know you. You know, I'm writing a book on this. Is it okay? I'll tell you, I'm completely open. Look, I'm a professor of sociology. You know, scar number 1, Berkeley, California, so blue. And we had some wonderful conversations, and actually quite a lot of common ground came out. But about my question, he threw it away. He said, you know what, we're ashamed of being the second poorest. We don't want to be the poorest. You know, those bad rates, yeah. And as Cajuns, they almost made fun of themselves, very self-deprecatory sense of humor about it. But he said, that's your question, it's not mine. We don't want to be reliant on the federal government or the state government. And they had, I don't know if you want my whole wrap of the book, but that there was a deep story underlying his political beliefs, and I think left and right, both of us, you know, have a deep story, and the book is about that deep story.
So what would you say is, Congressman, is the fundamental thing that folks in the Tea Party reach for politically? What do they want? What do they feel about their state of life?
You know, I don't know if it's as much the Tea Party as it is people in general. I mean, with you going down to Louisiana to talk to people, I mean, generally speaking, I serve the mountainous area of North Carolina, and there is a distrust of the government. In fact, there's a distrust of engaging globally. The very fact that I'm here does not get me points. And, you know, and so when you look back, you have to realize, well, no, you know, I think the interesting thing, I look out, I've got a colleague, a Democrat colleague that is on the front row. We have a lot more in common than the R or D would suggest. And what happens is you know, his wife has actually reached out to my wife, and they've been, I mean, truly could not have been more gracious. And sometimes we want to put people in a box, in a Tea Party box or a liberal box or this box. And really, everybody just wants to live the American dream if you're from America, or you want to have your kids. You know, you go to work not because necessarily that it's gratifying for you, that is one part of it, but really to provide for your children or your grandchildren so that they have a better way of life. Now, what happens is that comes into conflict. You know, many times in areas outside of the urban areas, it comes into conflict with they distrust the government, they distrust party politics, a lot of them, and so they're looking for someone to help make sure that they can rise out of poverty, and a lot of times it's very difficult. You know, so you have these labels. We started a caucus that, you know, we said we're for the millions of Americans who felt like Washington, D.C. had forgotten them. Now, we didn't have a party associated with that. In fact, if anything, you know, my party many times wishes we would go away. And so when you look at that, it's all about trying to make sure somebody has a voice. I probably have, you know, we've got somebody here with the union. I probably have more union support that would be typically a Democrat voter who said, all right, this guy is willing to hear what concerns me, the fact that I'm more concerned about what happens with my family than anything else. And so you take a typical Democrat voter who says, listen, I don't care about parties. And I think that honestly, that's what Donald Trump tapped into. He felt like wages were stagnant. So you got union workers voting for him. Perhaps the first time I had people coming up and saying, I've never voted for a Republican ever, and this billionaire is going to represent me, even though there's a huge disparity. So I think it's living the American dream. I've been blessed enough to do that. I mean, my wife and I started a small business with a $25,000 credit line. We came from nothing in very humble beginnings, and you know, and I've been in the Oval Office more in the last, you know, year than I ever imagined I would be, you know. So, but it's about meeting that fundamental need. So whether it's in the United States or in Switzerland or in Africa or anywhere else, everybody wants to make sure that they can provide for their family.
So let me turn to you, Mary Kay. So you do represent the unions. Where do you think they started to feel the disconnect, or if they felt a disconnect at all, with the government?
Well, I think of myself as representing home care providers and child care providers and registered nurses and corrections officers, 2 million people working hard every day who think they're left behind because the basic promise of America, where when you work hard, you ought to be able to get ahead and your children ought to be doing better than you've done, has been broken. And it seems like the audience in general feels with that. And I think for our members and for the 64 million people that are living in our country and working 2 and 3 jobs and can't find their way out of poverty like Mark did, I think they feel like the system's rigged against them on many levels. For African Americans in our country, the system's been rigged since slavery, and we haven't unrigged the rules. For immigrants in our country, the system's rigged because we can't figure out a public policy that gives a path to citizenship. And for all working people, CEOs and corporations are incentivized to not put money back into the pockets of workers so that wages are rising as our productivity rises. And so I think why we think it's really important for working people to be able to join together is it's a way for working people to join with government and with business leaders to rewrite the rules in a way that will allow us all to do better. And I believe, I'm optimistic, in spite of thinking that there is no my members generally feel their future is not going to be better. I'm optimistic that together in our incredible country that our government can come together if working people have a larger organization and say in being able to raise wages and allow our democracy to include everybody.
So Mike, let me tap your expertise as a CEO, as an employer of workers. Do you feel like corporate America has disconnected with the American middle class?
You know, it's an interesting challenge to think about America where we worked a little harder not to label each other and worked a little harder to solve problems. So I look at what's going on and this demonization of corporate America, and I find it very much at odds with the people I work with the peers I deal with, and the company I lead. We fundamentally exist, particularly in the company I lead, for a very important social purpose, to try and make the ill things that befall people corrected, and to do that in a way that can be done rapidly and fairly. That's a pretty useful thing to be doing. And when I hear broad swaths of Americans set aside because they're this or that, usually because they're different than the particular niche I occupy, I tend to shut down a little bit and say, let's really work on what's going on. Ironically, as I listen to this conversation, I would have been one of those hands up at the first side of it. I am more optimistic. That's because I believe fundamentally that these questions are a trailing indicator of people's experience. What they have been experiencing still is the slowest recovery from an economic dislocation in American history. And they are deeply embittered by that. Because when that happens over a long period of time, you will lose your faith in upward mobility, because it isn't happening around you. And in fact, what is happening around you is despair. Why is lifespan declining in America? Opioids is the simplest answer of all. And why is it so prevalent? Despair. So I think about what is the conversation we should be having that would unlock growth, unlock despair, because fracturing is a function of anger and jealousy that happens when opportunity is denied. You create opportunity again, which I actually believe is starting to happen, and I believe what comes from that will be a coming together and a focus on how to accelerate that progress. That's the conversation I'm here to engage in, and I believe it's at hand.
So one of the things, David, that is, I think, very much tied to opportunity is education. We're here talking about, Industry 4.0, a lot of technology displacing manufacturing jobs, which were very key part of the middle class experience in the United States. Where do you think we are failing in our educational system to provide people with opportunity, and where are we succeeding?
So there's a lot of wisdom on the panel, and I want to thank you for making me a part of it. I have to admit that I started out life, I'm going to burden you with a little personal information. My dad and his family came over from Russia 100 years ago next year. And I was in that group of people who were very optimistic about the United States because my dad said, don't tell me about your troubles. We have things that we can do in this country. My dad barely finished high school, and one generation later, me, his son was able to go to college and medical school and do all these unbelievable things that Grace has allowed me to do. But I have to admit, I vote with the 48% unless we make a few changes, and education, I think, could be one of them. I want to point out one thing that I know USA Today is well aware of because I've seen the coverage before. This is not the first time that people have been pessimistic. In polling data several times over the last 30 years or so, there have been dips in optimism like this. But I honestly think there's a couple things a little bit different about this. I spent some of my research career working on ways to take medical images and automatically analyze them so that you could have a machine assess how narrow your coronary artery was rather than have a cardiologist estimate by eyeball. And we had some success with it. I never thought that a few years later I'd be sitting here at Davos reminding everybody that we have 1.8 million truck drivers in the United States. 1.8 million truck drivers. Why do we have so many? That's one of the last occupations where you can make a middle-class wage without a college education. It's not going to be outsourced from overseas. You can't have someone in another country drive your truck in this country. And right now, those jobs are not automated. But I'm here to tell you there will be. And when they are automated, we're going to have a lot of people out of work all over the country. And so I'm finally going to answer your question. I'm known for my long, winding answer. And I appreciate your patience. I appreciate you not leaving during this answer. But I will say that we have a way to turn this around and move me back into the 23%. If we can think about education again as broader than the vocationally obsessed educational aspirations a lot of families, a lot of parents, and a lot of kids have right now, we're going to have several different careers over a lifetime as quickly as technology is changing, not just several jobs. And so in order to get ready for that wild, wild change that can give you whipsawed, we're going to have to go back to old-time education. Albert Einstein had, who should have been on this panel instead of me, had a saying that arts, religions, and science are branches from the same tree. I think we need to go back to where we are failing, and that is being too narrowly cast in having vocationally oriented education, even if it's at a research university, and reintegrate the social sciences, the humanities, the arts with the STEM disciplines. Because we're going to need not only to have an understanding of phenomena, like why does a star look like that, or what's dark matter, but we're going to have to understand society and people to know how to apply that knowledge. So I think we need to watch our tuition. We need to make sure that everybody has a way to get educated, and not just people going through the normal sequence, but those 1.8 million truck drivers. We're going to have to come together as a country and find ways to retrain them, re-educate them in different disciplines. And what keeps me up at night, I'm not being melodramatic, is how do we help those people put food on their table while they're being retrained? So that's what I'm concerned about.
Okay. Well, I want to note that we tried to get Albert Einstein and he didn't return my calls. So let me turn back to you, Congressman. Sure. So what do you think about how we close this gap between the folks who are starting to feel their jobs slip away and they don't see a way forward?
Yeah, I think a couple of things. One is the opportunity where they can actually see a path out. And so many times people that end up in despair, as was mentioned earlier, is because they don't see a way out. You know, they feel like, well, I'm just, this is the way it's going to be, and whether it was in Louisiana or anything else, they just come to that point where they can't see it. Now, the interesting thing is that, you know, my belief is that those paths out have to be opportunities and equal opportunities, but not necessarily that we put this person with this job and you allow them to use their God-given abilities, that you find that there's some people. I would hate to be a truck driver. I mean, and yet at the same time, I love numbers and I love to calculate and see that, and that would drive somebody else crazy. And so it's trying to find that, but the opportunity that we're talking about is really making sure that we don't stand in the way of allowing great creativity. Let's look at the nation of Israel. In terms of startup companies, more startup companies per capita in that one tiny little nation. And why is that? Where they're given the ability to fail. You know, we sometimes have this perfectionist mentality is don't fail at anything, and if you do, don't admit it. And yet, they are applauded for their failures because it brings them that much closer to success. So I think you have an expectation that you can fail. And the other is when we're talking about opportunities is that you listen to everyone. So you got a very diverse panel. You put together a good group hoping to get a good USA Today conflict. And so in doing that, though, you know, my philosophy, my son was a national champion debater, and so he would argue both sides of the same resolution. So you had to be prepared to argue. But my philosophy is there's an element of truth in everything that is said. Now, the question for us is to find out how much of it is truth. You know, how much of what she is saying do I perceive to be truthful? And then ultimately, how much of it is truthful. And so when you do that exploration of not having a box and finding out the differences, it creates opportunities that I think many times we sometimes miss in the bigger inner cities. We have, you know, this program that's going to help with this group and this program that's going to help with that group, instead of allowing for that mind to explore the possibilities and creativity.
So let me ask you a little pushback in that USA Today fighting spirit.
I would be disappointed if you didn't.
So while we're allowing that creativity to develop, you know, while we're allowing people to form their own opportunities, how do they put food on their table? How do they survive day to day and find housing? And what role should the government be playing in that?
You know, in terms of a helping hand, really what happens is, as I see two different things that are happening. The American people in general are very generous people, and even the government wants to provide that helping hand. At the same time, there's an interesting phenomenon that's going on even in my district where unemployment's at 4%. And yet we had some of the highest unemployment in 2008 of anywhere in the country. I mean, I had two counties that were above 20%. And so, I mean, and when you look at those numbers, they're staggering. However, what I've found is that we have to also put a value back in work. And what I'm seeing many times is that you have people that are going out and you say, well, we have two standards. We have probably 2,000 jobs that could be filled today in my district, and there's two standards. You pass a drug test and show up to work. Now, those are a pretty low bar, I mean, when you come to a work standard. And yet it gets back to what was said earlier. If you provide that support when they fall on hard times, and yet not so much so that it becomes a trap, so a safety net, but a net can be used for two things. It can be to catch you, or it can be to contain you. And sometimes we have a difficulty in the containment part that becomes really, we say, well, this is the way it's going to be, and gets back to where I started with this, where, well, I get this, I can't break out of it. So we've got to balance those two.
Mary Kay, I see you're champing at the bit there. You got something to say?
Well, I don't think it's so individualistic. I think that we have to take responsibility in a way that the cartoons showed us at the very beginning, that there are policy decisions and systems and structures that don't allow for individual creativity or initiative to flourish in a system where for the last 40 years, there's been this widening inequality in our nation. And when you look around the globe, other countries are dealing with that inequality in very different ways. So I was just in a conversation with the Nordic countries about the social dialogue between government, business, and civil society in Norway and Sweden, and they're dealing with inequality, and they make a different decision as a nation that childcare ought to be universal, so that women have equal access to the workforce, and that elder care is a municipal function so that I can go to work and not worry about my mom falling because she has access to a middle-class worker who can feed her family and not do what home care providers in the US do, which is work 100 hours a week and are in poverty, excluded from Social Security, used to be excluded from Fair Labor Standards Act, all because we've structured into the US economy an exclusion of people who are never going to make it to the middle class. And for the people that have held middle class jobs have no hope of holding onto it because we don't have an economic policy that deals with the 1.8 million truck drivers. And the 1.8 million truck drivers, that's no longer a middle-class standard of living. It was deregulated 40 years ago. There's 200,000 truck drivers left that have a middle-class standard of living. The rest of them are living in poverty. And they're called independent contractors because the employment relationship has been severed. And so, you know, that's not going to be solved through an individual deciding to have more initiative. There's a structural problem that's keeping truck drivers from leading a middle-class life in our nation. And it shouldn't just be truck drivers. Like home care providers and child care providers are care work in an economy that has never been valued in our nation. The Canadians value it, the Swedes value it. That is a really important job that our country needs as our population, as I age, as a 60-year-old, somebody's going to need to take care of me, and there's 1 million more of those jobs that are going to be needed in the next 5 years in the US. But they're poverty jobs. They aren't valued by us. And so when you think about what can be done, I just feel like it's a combination of working people being able to join together like we've been doing in supporting the fast food workers in their fight for 15 in a union. Imagine if the fast food companies did in the US what they've decided to do in other countries and allow those jobs to be middle-class jobs in the US. There's advertising that it's an entry-level job, but people are consigned to those jobs because they're structured in a way that doesn't allow them to do what Mark is saying. And I think there are individuals that sort of miraculously make it through, but it can't be that 4 million people want to do a minimum wage job that has no guaranteed hours and no benefits. That job should be financed by multinational corporations that decide to do that in Australia, Denmark, South Africa. Those jobs are $18 and $20 an hour jobs with a social security system where people have retirement and universal health care coverage and can actually provide for their families. So I just think it's more than individual choice. I think it's, as a nation, we have to make a decision that we aren't going to leave people behind. And I think what I have to do as a union leader is organize out of love. I think that the one video where he ends by saying it's harder to organize out of love than hate, that's not my experience. I think most working people in this country would fight to the death for their kids. And my experience is that happens out of love for each other. And I think that we want to continue to mobilize and unite people to make a demand on our government for values that I believe Mark and I share. That's the craziness of this situation in the US. That Mark and I both believe that we want a country where our children can do better than we've done. That's the promise of our nation. And that means that we have to decide as a nation that everybody's included. And we haven't done that.
I see a bilat coming together right there. Let me quickly ask Mike a question here. So the structures that Mary Kay is talking about, if those kinds of things were in place, would it help you get the workforce that you absolutely would love to have? Would it help your workers? Do you see it as something corporate America would buy into?
I think the one common thread that this panel would automatically agree on is the broken nature of the education system. If I was to think of one thing, I'm highly confident this group would agree on. And there are several elements to that I want to focus on as part of the answer to your question, because if we get this right, I'm not so sure Mary Kay will need to do all the organizing that she will have so much to do. I'd like to decline your workload by creating that workforce in another way. And let me start with two things. Number one, and this is the one I feel most passionately about, I've worked on this for a long time. Early childhood education is profoundly important, profoundly underfunded, and if I could invest $1 in one single thing, that would be it. It attacks intergenerational poverty, it provides new opportunities in populations that have had none, and it does it in an astonishing low price point with remarkable dividends over time. So if I would leave you with one thought, and when I say that phrase, early childhood ed, we tend to get it wrong. We think of expanding Head Start in the US and that. No, this is from -9 months to 3 years old. The brain, every bit of science says that's when we win them or lose them. And once we lose them, we lock them in, and then the upward mobility statistics are atrocious. Right. The odds of a kid being broken by the time they're 3 and recovering are nil. Number two, our current education system, this belief that we should still trundle off to school to be babysat by someone not very well paid and often not very well interested, is a phenomenal decision of risk for our children. Is this really, in a world, do we really think it modernizes the education system, that there's an iPad in the room? We have lost our minds. And think about where the world is going, to David's point. It's such a great point. The real underlying anxiety, I believe, is nativist fear brought on by globalization and technology. And they believe those are going to wipe out all the jobs. I don't believe that. I believe it will create whole new categories of work where empathy and a whole bunch of human skills that cannot be displaced will rise and be more important. But sure as heck, the changes are going to be really messy. And we better have a society that cares and helps people change. We better teach lifelong learning, which a classroom does not. We got to get these minds on a whole different path if they're going to be useful contributors in the future, and that will create the workforce I'm looking for.
All right. All right. I like to see this kind of passion. Good. All right, David.
Don't you just hate when you go to one of these panels and somebody says, you know, I agree with all the earlier points that were made. Well, damn it, I agree with all the earlier points that were made. But there's something missing from the panel, with respect to my co-panelists. It's what you had in the little clip in the beginning. It's the voice of the people affected. Now, I want to be presumptuous. The congressman goes back to his district. He probably gives this many speeches and this much listening. And when you go back to the union, you do this much speeches and this much listening. And so I think it's important that we find ways to bring the voice of people back into the conversation, because that's what America was really based on. In order to do that, I think we have to create, and it's terrible that we have to do this in a sort of an artificial way in 2018, we have to recreate sort of spaces where people feel comfortable disagreeing with each other and working their way through things, which is a great, great American tradition. Short commercial coming from museums, it'll be over soon. If you look at a lot of the trust polls of what people trust, the military, museums, and libraries tend to flow a little higher in trust than many other institutions, types of it.
Members of Congress are way up there.
Oh yeah, well I mean, you all are so high, you can't even talk about it. Did I do okay, Mark? Yeah.
Yeah.
But I do really, really believe that whether it's a museum or a library, or whether we just decide to have dinners around our table and bring some people in who we don't usually agree with and just talk it around a little bit, people are going to feel a little bit more empowered. And I want to have one little minor disagreement. It's not really a strong disagreement, but part of the reason that many people feel that school teachers are not getting the job done, it's sort of a careful seesaw result, or chicken and the egg thing. Is it because the skills aren't there, because we're not paying them enough or giving benefits enough to attract the right kind of people, or because the education isn't right, or because the feedback isn't right? It's a complex calculus to figure that out. But I think we need to listen to the voice of the people, perhaps a little bit more than we do, and find some clever ways of doing that.
Well, let Arlie take that question, because you have been spending a lot of time with the voice of the people. How would you suggest that we go about connecting with these folks, that the people in power, the people who have the ability to access Congress, the president, big money, jobs, connect?
The people I came to know felt very unheard and unrecognized, and felt anxious that their deep story was that they were anxious because they felt like they were waiting in line for the American dreams, kind of like, this is the deep story, they're like a pilgrimage, and their feet were faced forward, they were hardworking, they'd played by the rules, and their feet hadn't moved. 20 years, hadn't got a raise. And in the right-wing deep story, people seemed at the second moment be cutting in line. Who was that? Well, it would be blacks who through federally mandated affirmative action are finally given access to jobs reserved for whites. Even worse, women through federally mandated affirmative action, in their view, were finally given jobs formerly reserved for men, and then refugees and illegal immigrants, even animals. They thought, well, these environmentalists are putting animals over people. So it's waddling ahead and cutting in line. So it felt unfair to them. And they blamed Obama. They're really very alarmed by him because he seemed to be a line cutter too, waving to the line cutters. And, oh, the federal government isn't doing for me, it's forgotten me. And I'm going backwards. And the fear of that, the feeling of feeling estranged from the government and pushed back culturally, not their culture anymore. They felt seen as racist and homophobic and sexist and fat. That's how they felt that liberals saw them, and ill-educated and so on. So they were insulted, and how you now connect them. I'm now part of a movement that's, you won't hear about newspaper. I hope you hear about it in USA Today eventually, but it's called the Bridge Alliance. There is a umbrella group, some 80 different civic kind of grassroots organizations with funny names like Hi from the Other Side or Living Room Conversation. And it's actually started by moderate Republican and Democrat. And some of my Louisiana people have been up to visit me in Berkeley, and we've done a number of these living room conversations, left and right together. And you, in a way, help restore what's natural and what both sides really want. So I see something happening. I have to say that I don't think we're getting national leadership from the top in this, but there is nonetheless a people-to-people movement. And I have a vision of what, if you want that, of what we really need.
If you can make it brief, because I didn't leave enough time for questions from the audience.
Okay,
so
okay.
We'll give you a 1-minute sum up.
Okay, unions used to pull people from different sectors of society, different classes and regions, rural, urban, black, white together. And the military used to pull us together, you know, compulsory military for men, or, you know, public schools when everybody went to them, pull people together. Now we need to make it up. And I'd like to see a high school program for high school seniors. Spend a month outside their region and class. So you get coast to go inland, and inland to go coast. You get south to go north, you get north to go south for a month of, and you train students ahead in active listening and in the importance of civic engagement. So you prep them for it, and then they work together on building homes for the homeless or installing solar panels, something. I think we need to make that up, and I'd love Congress to actually fund it.
Okay, well, we have very little time left, so I'm going to ask if anyone here has any questions, but I would ask that you make your question brief. Yes.
My name is Anjara Jackson. I'm from the United States. I'm a physician there. I do appreciate all of your comments. I think it's been some great insight, but I think a number of you touched upon bringing different people together. I have to say, when the panel walked up, I was extremely struck by the fact that there's not one person of color on that panel. How can you begin a dialogue talking about addressing the needs of people who are left behind when they are not included? I'm very disappointed about that. It's more of a comment than a question.
Okay, no other questions? All right, well then we'll go back to the panel. So who would like to weigh in with there are questions. Oh, sorry.
Thank you. This is a question perhaps to the congressman, perhaps to someone else. One of the things that I'm hearing is that a large number of folks who feel left behind, who've voted for this administration, resent labels, that other people are using labels and they don't like that. But I've heard you talk about those people living in the cities. And I think that labels have been used by everybody. And so I'm not sure if you'd like to address that or not.
Sure, I'll be glad to. I think really demographically, I think is what I was referring to, because you can have Tea Party members in the middle of Washington, D.C., both of them, so your point is well taken. I think the real interesting dynamic is that you see this left behind side of things with people of color, people in rural areas that many times feel like that they're just not being pulled into that American dream. And you're right, there's people who feel like they're getting in line, that somebody's getting in line in front of them. But I also think, you've got a very relatively diverse, excluding the well-taken point, from an ideological point of view right here in the way that maybe we see the world. So the critical thing is to have dialogue without making a certain assumption. The very fact that I talk a little slower than most people from New York automatically conjures up the fact that they think I think as slow as I talk, but we have these bias that automatically get hit with all of us. And I think one of the interesting things in Congress is that I probably have just as many very dear Democrat friends that can't be public with that, because if they are public with it, all of a sudden they're seen on the House floor with a camera picture of the vast right-wing conspiracy being right there beside someone who's progressive, and we've got to do away with that. I can tell you, for me, in my office, we've gone out and I said, I want you to find every Democrat piece of legislation that I could possibly co-sponsor, and to try to start to break that down. Some of my dear Elijah Cummings is an African-American congressman from Maryland. Dear friend, I would do anything for him. In fact, he has a piece of legislation was signed into law under this president that I co-sponsored. He was the lead person. And when we look at that, we're combining on different things like prescription drug prices and why they should be so high, because that doesn't just affect his district, which is Baltimore, an urban area. It affects mine, which is a rural area, where it's, a big city is 900 people. And so we've got to find ways to do that. But so many times we put this special label on, and it's our way of describing who they may or may not be. And you have a certain perception. I mean, you've Googled, y'all have done your Google research on all of us up here. And so you have a certain perception of what we're going to be like. And what I love to do is go into a conversation with somebody and just blow their mind and say, well, I'm for this or I'm for that. And so if we can do that, regardless of where somebody lives, and it gets back to the point you were making, we want everybody to have an opportunity, regardless of who they are, what color they are, what race they are, where they live, and yet many of them, the reason why we think that they're not going to, our kids are not going to have it is because it's for the well-connected, or it's for the person that might have to be in this particular location. I still believe in an America that says that that type of opportunity is there, and yet I find when I walk a mile in their moccasin, I have a very different perspective, so we need to do more of that.
So speaking of legislation, and this panel seemed to be a lot in agreement on education. What do you think about Mike's idea of early childhood education, 0 to 3? Would that be something you would bring to your colleagues in Congress on both sides of the aisle?
Yeah, the real question, and certainly, you know, he's right from a physiological standpoint. I mean, we know the brain development is there, and yet what we've got to make sure of is that those types of things actually produce a result. And so as we look at that, providing that opportunity there, when we look at government being the answer, I've been involved with that enough to see where they really make huge mistakes. And yet I probably have been in more schools in my district than any other candidate you know, in the last 2 decades. So looking at how do we best do that, and how do we best fund that, is certainly something that honestly Ivanka Trump has been bringing up a number of times and trying to soften that.
Okay. All right. I think we have time for one last question. Is there anything from the audience? Okay. Somebody over here?
Conversation around the gutted social contract, right? That we feel that we're unbelievably missing in the U.S. And in some ways, and I don't want to point at you, Congressman, but I feel like you're creating an opportunity for us to do so.
I do that quite often, but go ahead.
And it's not a bias or perception or anything. It's a question as to what would you just articulate as fundamental to the social contract of the United States? Because it doesn't feel like in a party sense that we're getting it in healthcare or investment in education or the fundamental things that actually support workers and regulation around making the world safe and grow. And so I just want to hear your
thoughts. Okay, so this is going to be the rapid round. So you got 30 seconds.
Rapid round. Government normally does not provide equality, it provides inequality. And that will be like nails on a chalkboard to many of you. But generally speaking, if government is the one who's deciding the winners and losers, it typically will enter into a contract that is not fair or equal.
Mary Kay, respond, 30 seconds.
I just think that we are in a global forum where we're trying to encourage social dialogue between many different parts of civil society, employers, academics, elected officials. And if government is not a lever for equality in this world, I don't know what is. And so, especially in the United States, where the people speak through how we participate in our democracy, I think we have to, while we share values, we clearly have a very different opinion of how we get things done. And I do think it requires a new social contract where we reach agreement on the basic things that we as taxpayers want to have for everyone in our nation, and that we want everyone included. We want every immigrant on a path to citizenship. We want every returning citizen from prison to be able to also exercise their vote. We want to enfranchise our people to participate in our democracy. And I think it happens by expanding the ability of unions, because people can have disagreements when they trust each other and can speak across difference.
Okay, well, that is it for us. Please give a warm round of thanks to our panelists. Thank you all for joining us today.
to what's going on in the United States, a little bit of context as Beta Zone will tee up John Chipman.
Thank you very much, Fred Kemp, and thank you very much to the World Economic Forum Davos for giving me this opportunity to talk about shifting military power. The map that you see in front of you now is a map of the IISS, the International Institute for Strategic Studies, that demonstrate the extent, range, and depth of conflict around the world today. The majority of those conflicts are internal conflicts. And the thesis that I'm putting forward to you today is that the nature of international relations today is such that the possibility of great power conflict is back. Arguably, its likelihood is higher now than at any point in the last 25 years. And this is because two of the big powers in the world, China and Russia, are beginning to try to challenge the global predominance of the United States and its allies. And they're doing so not only on the ground, but also through their declaratory policy. Vladimir Putin, our commanders always have the authorization to use any means for the defense of the Russian Federation. The chief of his general staff, we must not copy foreign experience and chase after leading countries, but we must outstrip them and occupy leading positions ourselves. President Xi Jinping, we will make it our mission to see that by 2035, the modernization of our national defense and our forces is basically completed, and that by the 21st century, our people's armed forces have been fully transformed into world-class forces. And the French naval commander noting the strategic landscape is changing rapidly. China, for example, built in the last 4 years the equivalent of the entire French Navy. And I'll put a footnote to that to say that in September 2016, the French Navy was outstripped in the Mediterranean by the presence of the Chinese Navy. There were more Chinese naval vessels in the Mediterranean than there were French. And at present, the US administration is, of course, having a challenging time in working with its NATO allies, it's working with its Asian allies. There's a degree of unpredictability in the geopolitical environment. Europeans, for their part, are becoming a little bit more conscious that the world is a dangerous place, but their capabilities have been hollowed out since the end of the Cold War, and perhaps even more hollowed out in the wake of the austerity that they've had to conduct after 2008. Now, great power conflict isn't inevitable, but we are at an inflection point, and I think that some of the initiative is moving towards the challengers to the status quo rather than those who wish to protect the status quo. But defense spending is still an interesting indicator of the distribution of effort, and you can see from that slide that still today, the United States remains by far the largest defense spender in the world, at more than US $600 billion in the last year, 38% of the total. But Russia and China are spending quite well themselves. The difficulty is that Russian and Chinese defense spending is not very transparent. For instance, China, that is indubitably the second biggest defense spender in the world, we estimate their defense expenditure at $195 billion. The official budget in China is $150 billion. And the difference resides in the fact they don't put a lot of things in their defense budget. The State Council, for example, of China is in charge of arms purchases, and that's not part of their defense budget. The other interesting thing that has happened in recent years is the way in which defense spending has changed region by region. Since 2011, defense spending in Asia has surpassed total spending in Europe. And during the Cold War, while NATO states dedicated a high degree of their national wealth to military expenditure, with defense expenditure sometimes being as high as 6% of GDP, almost all key NATO states spending way above the current declared minimum of 2%, now only 5 do. And this slide shows a little bit those trends. Look at those numbers in 1980. France spending 3%, Germany 2.7%, Turkey 5%, the UK 6%, The United States, 6%. And then you come down all the way down to 2017, and you see those numbers rather dramatically reduced. 1.9% for France, 1.1% for Germany, United Kingdom just about holding it 2%, and the United States, even with this great talk about making America great again and spending a lot of money to ensure the United States stays ahead of their peer competitors, at 3.1%, it still is a proportion of GDP, a lot less than what United States was spending at the height of the Cold War. China is the country that is moving most rapidly to become a peer competitor of the United States. They have made rapid strides in the field of air-to-air missiles, putting high-value platforms of the United States that used to be able to loiter safely outside of engagement zones in the Taiwan Straits, for example, under great risk. Within the next 2 years, the United States will lose its monopoly on operational stealth combat aircraft, with the Chinese J-20 entering service, that J-20 having stealth technology that the Chinese state stole from Western industry through their intellectual property theft operations. China continues to pursue advanced technologies, extremely high-performance computing, quantum communications, AI, and what this slide is demonstrating is that they're making a lot of their advanced weapons available for export. Where the United States is unwilling to sell, the Chinese will often enter that vacuum, and the result is that there are more lethal weapons in more hands in more places, and the West will have to deal with an environment in which all military domains are more contested. Now, it's important also to underline that technology in itself is not the only factor that matters. The enemy gets a vote too, as military commanders like to say. The current US National Security Advisor, General McMaster, has a nice phrase. He says there are two ways to fight the United States military: asymmetrically and stupid. And of course, countries that have less technological capacity vote for fighting the United States asymmetrically. And it's also true that technology is difficult to adopt within armed forces. Chinese military lacks combat experience. They're in the process still of developing joint doctrine and training. But the point here is that China is catching up fast. And Chinese defense spending and military capabilities are not limited by mainland China's geographic borders. China is, of course, hugely concerned about maintaining its sovereignty over the South China Sea. And since 2013, China has reclaimed land at outposts in the South China Sea. And by 2015, it had reclaimed 2,900 acres of land, or 17 times more than all the other claimants to that territory combined. While President Xi Jinping pledged in 2015 not to militarize China's islands in the South China Sea, Chinese-occupied islands in the Spratlys now host munitions depots, sensor arrays, radar systems, missile shelters, as well as three 3,000-meter runways on the big three islands. And together, China's presence in the Paracels and the Spratlys provides the PLA pretty comprehensive military coverage of the entire South China Sea. And those of us gathered here in Davos have been extremely seized by that great Chinese geoeconomic experiment, the Belt and Road Initiative. And while it is primarily an economic project, the Belt and Road Initiative will be giving China tremendous infrastructure on which it could choose to build military installations, developing a wider international footprint. They already have a base in Djibouti, and they are exercising, as I said earlier, in the Baltic and Mediterranean seas. So when you hear the People's Republic of China perhaps noting with concern the occasional appearance of American, French, or British naval vessels in the South China Sea, the Chinese have been as close to the Baltics and the Mediterranean themselves. Now, moving back to Europe, we are, I think, properly concerned about the resurgence of a potential threat from Russia. Russia is a country that understands the laws of asymmetry in conflict. They've been able to bring different levers of state power to orchestrated effect in causing challenges in Western Europe. The conflicts in which they've engaged in Ukraine, in Syria, have served as test and evaluation laboratories for Russian technology, military doctrine, and military personnel. And Russia has demonstrated lots of anti-access, area denial, force projection capabilities that are creating more challenges for Europe. We have a map here of Kaliningrad, just to remind geographically that Kaliningrad is Russian territory. It's an enclave within Poland, and Russia has the option of potentially deploying intermediate range weapons in Kaliningrad, and without wishing to frighten too much, if you look at those ranges, you can see that Davos would be within the range of Russian missiles that might be deployed in Kaliningrad. But actually, I don't think, personally, as a strategist, that it's Russian military deployments that are the greatest threat now to European security, stability, and prosperity. It's much more the asymmetric tactics that Russia is able to employ, and is doing so without limitations from domestic or international law. Russian strategy is to, where possible, undermine our open societies from the inside. And there are at least 3 areas where people here gathered in Davos, interested in the Western liberal order, interested in business and prosperity, should be concerned about in the way in which Russia now exercises its state power. The first is the way in which they are leveraging their financial power, including in the private sector, potentially to purchase controlling shares in infrastructure in Europe that they might later be able to manipulate. The second is the propaganda that they are targeting steadily and effectively at Russian-speaking minorities in the Baltic states, in the Balkans, and in animating pro-Russian political parties, both on the left and the right wings of various political spectrums. And the third is in their assertion of cyber power through interference in democratic processes. And this includes the dissemination of perhaps not fake news, but junk news, trolling, and we should not rule out more direct interference. And we have a slide here showing RT and Sputnik, and there should be no doubt that these are instruments of the Russian state in order to advance Russian thinking and to undermine support for the open, prosperous societies in the liberal West. The sad fact is that today's Russia does not seem to be overly invested in the current international order. And while we worry about the rules-based order being undermined from within our Western societies because of the leaders that we sometimes actually elect or risk electing, the challenge to the rules-based order also comes from the outside, and I think Russia is a principal challenger of that rules-based order. Coming back to the debate on defense, though, again to see quite how big the gap has grown since the height of the Cold War. Look at the numbers there in 1990, the kinds of forces that West Germany alone had deployed or at its disposal, and you add those with Italy, France, United Kingdom, and the European Command of the United States, and then you look at the figures in 2015, all the way across this bottom screen. If you added up all of these charts in the bottom screen, Germany, Italy, France, UK, United States, European Command, they just about equal what West Germany alone had in 1990. So when people talk about the hollowing out of our military resources on the European continent, this is the gap they're talking about. There's no argument necessarily for going back all the way to those numbers, but this gap is quite an extraordinary one, especially at a time when Russia is determined to potentially use military force more on the European continent as they have in Georgia and in Ukraine. And just looking at the personnel deployed numbers, look at those numbers from 1995, nearly 4 million, coming down over the years to just under 2 million. So when people are calling for an increase in defense budgets, an increase in equipment, an increase in personnel, this isn't an attempt to go back to the numbers of the Cold War, but just to begin to rebuild from the huge cuts that were optimistically taken when the Cold War ended and people thought there would be a peace dividend, and then the cuts that were additionally imposed after 2008 when the economics of austerity took hold. So in conclusion, the United States and Europe are now going through a bout of what I style strategic arthritis. There is so much effort in strengthening our domestic economies, on reconnecting with our people, on ensuring social inclusion and the like, understanding our electoral processes in the modern and digital age, and we have let the first mover advantage slip from us to these other anti-status quo powers, principally China and Russia. And if I were to leave you with one message, is that in geopolitics, just as in business, there is a first mover advantage. And in the last few years, Russia and China have been creating facts on the ground that complicate the maintenance of that liberal democratic order that we all champion. And if we are to sustain it, we need to gain the initiative politically and to a degree, again, even militarily. Thank you very much.
John, that was absolutely brilliant. I'm Fred Kemp. I'm President and CEO of the Atlantic Council. So let me have you be thinking about your questions in the audience and online. Online, you can send in your questions at wwf.ch/betazone. And I'll also turn to what I get in from online as well. Let me start with one question, and I want to go back to Mattis's 2018 National Defense Review, which came out last week. There seems to be a shift in what he's doing. I'd like to hear from you how dramatic that is, considering everything that you've shown us here. And that is, he's saying terrorism is still important, but we're in great power competition again, and that's exactly what you've been talking about. He says that's where we have to focus our attention. And China and Russia, but they're quite different challenges. And so maybe you can drill down a little bit on how you think the U.S. is seeing these challenges differently and how they're going to equip themselves for it. He did still talk about North Korea and Iran and rogue situations, but not as the competition priority. And then in talking about the Middle East, it sounded as though the U.S. was going more in a direction of equipping its allies, and that it wasn't going to do as much on its own with its own military, but it was looking more at the great power. Does that sound about right, and how does this fit into to what you're seeing here?
Well, Jim Mattis, the current U.S. Secretary of Defense, is a great strategist with enormous experience of all three of those key domains, Europe, the Middle East, where he was CENTCOM commander, and the Asia-Pacific, or as some people like to style it, the Indo-Pacific. I would respond to your points in these ways. I think there is real concern in the United States that China will be, sooner than they had thought, a genuine peer competitor, and that the great scientific genius of China is being deployed also in order to leap into new domains. And so I think this national security strategy is an alert to the United States to make certain that the United States continues to stay a little bit ahead of China and maintains the capability to do what it wants to do, which is maintain the status quo. And if China ever got to the point where it felt it could change the status quo, including across the Taiwan Straits, by forcibly unifying Taiwan without any fear the United States could militarily prevent that, that would be destabilizing. So I think that's the way the United States is principally looking at China. It is China's military development amongst other powers that is the most challenging. In Russia, I think the United States establishment does see this broader array of threats coming from Russia and the need to have a genuinely comprehensive strategy. And of particular importance with Russia will be getting on the front foot in countering the kinds of narratives that Russia insidiously seeks to inject in the region. As for the Middle East, what is evident is that a number of Middle East powers are wanting to have the capability to take things in their own hands. And I think the most important thing for the United States to be doing in this period is be working closely with its partners still to ensure that there is a joint strategy for dealing with the common threats perceived in the Middle East. And here again in the Middle East, while there are some classic military threats, like, for example, the potential Iranian ballistic missile threats to the members of the Gulf Cooperation Council, which could probably be met by coordinated GCC missile defense with the United States. There are other threats, like Iran's activity in the region, using proxies, using agents, using all sorts of other non-traditional actors, for which a proper diplomatic military strategy has not yet been arrived at, and I think that will be, in 2018, a very big priority of the US administration, working with its European allies and its key Middle Eastern allies to understand how to contain Iran's continued effort to export its revolution.
Excellent, thanks, John. And we've got 7-8 minutes left. Let me ask one more question, and then I'll go to you and I'll go online. And I know this one you could answer in 2 hours, but the one thing that Matt has also said, which pertains to this, is part of it is interesting is what's happening with the numbers, what's happening with the percentages. Part of it is how much of it is useful and how much of it is useless. And he's essentially saying we're investing in a lot of legacy systems that may not even be useful in future scenarios. As you look at the military balance from that standpoint, is the U.S. as robust as we think it is?
I think Jim Mattis makes a very good point, especially in the European theater. Too much effort in the debate in NATO and in Europe has been on inputs, like getting 2% to defense expenditure. But that's an input measure, it's not an output measure. Another measure is spending 20% of your defense budget on equipment. Well, that's fine, but what are you actually buying with it? And are you buying the relevant things? Are you able to operate with allies? And I think another priority for the United States and its European allies in 2018 will be again rehearsing collaborative military activity. NATO hasn't done in the last 10 or 15 years the kinds of exercises that it was during the Cold War. And I think one of the things that the US and its European allies will need to be doing is to reinvent the kinds of exercises that will be relevant to meet the potential challenges from Russia in the next few years.
Thank you very much. So one question from online, it could also be from one of you here, and this is from Mr. or Ms. Anonymous. The question is, what's the biggest concern the U.S. has on China's military development? So to drill down and get a little bit more specific, let me add my own to that, which is I've heard from the Pentagon growing concern about the space domain, which has a lot to do with the Internet of Things, has a lot to do with GPS and autonomous vehicles and almost everything else now.
So the two things the United States are concerned about, and I'll treat the second first, is indeed space. China has put an enormous amount of effort into space technology, launching more satellites and being able to win the arms race in space. So that is a domain that's hugely interesting and worrying to the United States. I think the second is its access and area denial strategy, where US aircraft carriers and others become so vulnerable operating in the region that they lose their military effectiveness.
Questions, please. Identify yourself, and we know who you're asking the questions.
Hello, Mr. Chipman. Itamar Rabinovich from Israel. Given what you just said about the U.S. need to rethink strategy vis-a-vis Iran in 2018, what is your position on the JCPOA?
I have a very simple view on the Iran deal, which is that it is a technical agreement. It's an arms control agreement. Now, in the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union had all sorts of arms control agreements. And those arms control agreements did not remotely imply that the United States and the Soviet Union had strategic agreement on anything else, nor did it prevent the United States and the Soviet Union from competing all around the world in order to win for their own side. So I would prefer people in the region to see the Iranian agreement for the narrow technical agreement that it is. It's a simple arms control agreement. Put that in a box. And the reason it's useful to put that in a box is that without that box, Iran would be a few months away from a nuclear weapon. Now it might be, if they adhere to the agreement and we adhere to the agreement, 10 years away from a weapon. Sometimes in diplomacy and strategy, kicking the can down the road is not a bad thing. During those 10 years, there's every reason for the United States, its partners and allies in the Middle East to continue to confront Iran in all the other geographies and in all the other domains in which Iran is acting as a malign actor. And the JCPOA does not prevent the United States, its Gulf allies, its European allies, its partner in Israel to confront Iran in these other domains on these other subjects.
Excellent answer. Majid Jafar. Oh, hold on. Let's wait for the microphone. And if you could identify yourself even though
Majid Jafar, Crescent Petroleum. So in the UAE. First question, very basic and a clarification question, which was the number of troops you said at the disposal of West Germany. Presumably those were mostly US and other, so not German troops. It's not a like for like. But then this is kind of an ignorant devil's advocate question. The presentation was very much about decline in troop levels and spending as well. Does that matter so much today? I mean, aren't we anyway, you know, every industry represented here is seeing less labor intensity and more automation, including my own oil and gas. So isn't that just the way things are headed with defense as well? Does it matter not having as many troops? Is it about defensive capability against a particular threat, or is it about the ability to operate in multiple theaters at one time?
There's no question that quality is usually much better than quantity in the current strategic era where technology is so very important. The difficulty is that there hasn't been as much investment in that technology, and there remain strategic moments when there is a need to be able rapidly to deploy to a theater, to have troops on the ground, to be able to hold and maintain territory. And there has been a technological conceit in the past where technology could do everything for you and the human dimension was less important. Remember during the second Iraq War, when the then US Secretary of Defense, Rumsfeld, was arguing with his commanders all the time, can't we do this with fewer and fewer troops and ultimately they were trying to do it with as few as 75,000, when actually part of the challenge, once the conflict was won with Iraq, was holding territory, making certain that there wouldn't be looting, making certain there was basic stability, while one permitted some form of Iraqi state to reconstruct itself. So in great power conflict, which unfortunately is a risk I've identified, people do matter, and ability to rapidly deploy matter, and even the United Kingdom and France, the two European powers that have traditionally had a capacity rapidly to deploy, are hollowing that capacity out, and it makes it very difficult for them to be proper partners to the United States in maintaining order.
So as they say in the TV business,